Hello and welcome to A Tippling Philosopher with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Thank you so much for being here with me, and thank you to all you new viewers who have come on board. A lot to talk about today, but not an awful lot of movement on the front lines. And that is in itself a discussion point, something that is dividing observers and analysts and all sorts. But anyway, let's get on to the front lines. So here we're going to start with the sort of Oskil River, the Svatove-Cremina front line here. Let's just zoom in to our target area on the map of Ukraine. So we've got Svatove and Kreminna. We had Liman falling and Kupiansk being liberated as well. The question has been over the last few days, what will the Ukrainians do? Will they try and loop round to encircle these major towns here, Kreminna, Rubizhne, Severodonetsk, and Lysychansk? Will they strike for Starobilsk after taking Svatove, which is a hub, but the hub that's not so useful anymore because they've broken across this P66 highway road, and they obviously control the rail from up here in Kupiansk. So therefore, the railway is not particularly useful, and the road transportation is at least under fire control, if not broken completely. And so therefore you can't really get supplies from Svatove down to Kreminna. So therefore the next obvious step is Starobilsk. Will they go for that, or will they encircle, or will they do both? But there's been a pause. The question kind of is, why is that? At least according to the Ukrainians, they've taken a pause to replenish reserves and then continue very soon. That doesn't please some analysts, and I will talk about that in a second after I've just quickly gone through the front line. So let's zoom in a little bit to the Svatove-Cremina front line. We have had, yesterday I said, look, basically the front line was down here, but I didn't really talk about which of these towns was controlled by Ukraine and which wasn't, and what's been going on. These things are often dynamic, and one person will tell you that this town's been liberated and someone else will say it's not, and then the Ukrainians will say one thing, the Russians will say another. So Makivka is a place that Ukrainians have claimed to have liberated. Russians are now saying, actually, we still control half of it, but then provide no evidence for controlling half of it. So you kind of have to make an educated guess sometimes, and I might say something based on different sources, and it might not be true. What usually happens is it becomes true within a day, but I might be off by a day. So, some of the little villages in the Kherson front line and some of the towns here may or may not be under Ukrainian control, as I claim. So yesterday I claimed that this was broadly the front line for the Ukrainians. We have Kreminna down here, Svatove up here, and we have a bunch of towns that go up here and up here. And the question is, so here particularly, which ones are controlled by Ukraine, which ones are contested? And then we have, there's this river I was talking about yesterday, the Krasna, that the Ukrainians have got onto the eastern side at Krasno-Rachensky. Do they control Krasno-Rachensky? No, I don't think so. I think that's contested, but they are certainly either pushing there or the other side, elements of being the other side of the river there. And not the other side of the river, but the other side of the highway further down south. So that's what I said yesterday. This is, I've zoomed into basically this area here, but I've taken it off the terrain map just for a bit of clarity. So here is Krasno-Rachensky, and there's another settlement down here. That it's not marked here, but it's this one in white there. That is where the Ukrainians have got to the other side of the P66 highway. We have, had claims from Ukrainians and evidence that they have liberated these settlements up to Makivka and a couple of settlements south of there. Is it Herevkiv? Let's just go in a little bit. Google Maps is really sensitive at the moment, and it's not zooming in very nicely. But just south of Makivka is another settlement. Yeah. No, it's not south. It's to the west. Makivka, that has been liberated for sure. So we're at this situation where Not really sure which of these towns up north of Makivka towards the Russian front line here are under control of Ukraine or whether they're just completely contested. That's, where we're at the moment. The Russians seem to want to have a little bit of a buffer zone for obvious reasons between themselves as a front line and Svatove, so that they can use at least some of this highway and so that they can protect Svatove. But they've also got these towns here. The Russians have claimed to have done a counterattack sort of southwest of Kreminna to Dobrova, which is a place that was liberated by the Ukrainians just around the Liman liberation as a stepping stone towards Kreminna. There seems to be very little evidence about that. Russians will often claim things. It's very difficult to work out the truth of these matters, especially when there's what's called OPSEC, operational security. So the Ukrainians are really good at being pretty silent about stuff that's going on in the places they want to be silent about. So Kherson is an example of that and has been for some time, and we'll come on to that. But so that's what's going on. Not really 100% sure of the exact towns. You get different maps. So this one is saying that Dobrova is now contested. Whether that's true, we shall see. And here's another map to say, Krasno Rychinsky we've had this push by the Ukrainians across this highway to that place, and then just down south of there, but slightly north of Kreminna, the Ukrainians are also pushed in. Now, there's an interesting. Yesterday, I think it was, the Russians were giving a public statement about, the Ministry of Defense was saying this is what we're doing, blah blah blah, blah, and they're standing in front of maps, and so when people record the TV, obviously, and then look at the maps that the Russians themselves are using, and it turns out that it's told us quite a few things, but we understand now that basically the Russians have admitted to pulling out of the Kharkiv Oblast, which is a region or county. This is the Kharkiv Oblast here. And they've admitted to pulling out apart from this northern part. So where it's all pink here, up to this the purple dotted line, actually the Russians have admitted to not being there at all. So that is interesting in and of itself. If we come back to the map here. So basically this whole area here should really be yellow. At least according to the Russians themselves. They have pulled back there to at least the Luhansk border. Further up north, they are still in control of this, but it's not terribly important here. There you go. Okay, so moving on to Kherson, we have the area here, obviously. There has been this lightning move over the last few days, and then it sort of settled on this Milove to Bruschiansky line, and basically not a lot has happened yesterday. And this is the point I'm going to talk about in a second, the consternation amongst some analysts as to why that is. There have been claims of several columns of artillery and grads and armaments going from Melitopol across to Kherson. So they are obviously trying to reinforce this area. The Russians are also at the same time saying it looks like the Ukrainians are going to try and cut down to possibly encircle Melitopol. I don't know whether they're spreading that as disinformation or whether they're genuinely worried about that. If they are genuinely worried about Melitopol being attacked, then it's odd that they're moving loads of armaments from there to Kherson. But then if Kherson goes, they're in trouble. So, it's about getting your priorities sorted. Okay, so if I go down, a little bit of movement has happened down in the southern, literally near the city of Kherson, very close to the city. So there are 4 little villages there that are either contested or now under the control of the Ukrainians. So here's my little map. going from another Alexandrivka. There seem to be a lot of places. A lot of places in Ukraine have the same name. So you'll do a Google search for a town or village, and it turns out that it's in Ukraine like 6 or 7 times. You'll find out which one you're talking about. So this seems to be quite a common name. It goes up to there and across to here, blah blah blah. But it's these sort of 4 villages here that are really relatively close to Kherson that are being contested at the moment. So the line goes there, where yesterday it was sort of across there more. So we have got a little bit of movement in that section of the Kherson front, and possibly a little bit of movement around here after Davidiv Brid was taken. A few settlements nearer to there. So we go onto my map from yesterday. So Davidiv Brid is up here, and this was Milove across to Bruskinsky, and some places in between, and not a lot of change. There was talk about this being quite an important settlement that was liberated by the Ukrainians. It looks like maybe the Ukrainians have made a bit of inroad, and some people. There's one map that says Shkalove. Sorry, I'm butchering these names, but have a laugh at my expense. Is contested, so there could be quite a movement down there, which would. So here's one such map, which is then, as soon as you start getting movements like this, then Russians that are going to be sitting here are going to be thinking, oh my goodness, I'm now weak from 2 sides. So then they think, okay, do I need to move out? On the flip side, if the Russians are strong, if you make an incursion into enemy territory, then you are yourself victim to being flanked on either side. So, that can work both ways. But the point is that other than maybe a little bit of movement here, not a great amount of movement considering what had happened the couple of days before that. Okay, I made a claim, and loads of people piled on to say, yeah, but, and I sometimes forget that I make a claim the day before, and then I make another claim, and because not everyone's watching all my videos, they don't necessarily join up my claims and take one in isolation. But essentially, ostensibly, the viewers, were right. So I said that when there was an 80-kilometer front line here that the Russians were holding, and then after a couple of days, it was cut down to 40 kilometers. And I said, well, they've still got broadly the same amount of troops, but now they've got half the amount of front line to defend. So actually, they are potentially stronger in defending that front line. So all other things remaining equal, that's kind of true, right? So they are stronger in, they'll have more troops per kilometer. And loads of you came on and said, yeah, but now this region is smaller. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. So there's such a stronger concentration of forces that actually, once you get the artillery on, then it's pretty easy going. So on the one hand, they are stronger in defending, but on the other hand, they are easier to hit and become targets because they're more grouped together. And that's what I said the day before. So the day before, this was the map from the day before, where I was saying, as they are moved into a smaller and smaller area, the Russians are able to be hit by artillery from all sides. So when they had this longer front here, the artillery might be positioned some way back, and they can hit just into this area. But then I said, as the front becomes smaller, the artillery can almost surround the Kherson, Russian controlled area, and they can hit anyone and everywhere inside that area with greater focus, greater intensity. So yes, exactly right. That on the one hand there are more troops, on the other hand they are easier to hit. So that dynamic will be played out. So to get back to this idea that the Ukrainian troops have stopped, there are some analysts and observers and YouTubers and people on social media saying that actually Ukraine are losing momentum here and they're not taking initiative. And in fact, if they're a decent attacking side, they should be on the coattails of the Russian troops as they are retreating, harrying their withdrawal, and taking advantage of the fact that the Russians are in disarray. And this is an example of the Ukrainians being not very good at attacking. and this is bad decision making. There are other people that are saying, as you can see here, that actually they're regrouping, replenishing reserves in order to then continue being in the best position to continue. And what is the truth? Well, we can discuss this, and you can discuss it in the thread, but it's open to debate. I'm sure they know what they're doing, right? They're being well advised by NATO and the West, and at the end of the day, we don't know whether they've got enough troops to continue a very quick momentum, whether that will leave them prone to counterattacks. But also, you've got to remember that when Ukraine go into towns and villages and any kind of urban areas, it is different to the Russians doing it. So the Russians will flatten a place and then walk in and then whatever. It doesn't really matter. The Ukrainians, they are liberating places. So first of all, when there are people there aren't necessarily people in these ghost villages in Kherson, but up in Kreminna area, there will be towns where they're liberating and the people will be hugging them and clapping them. And the Russians never had to experience that. So that kind of slows you down a little bit as you're literally liberating humans and dealing with humans. But then they had to clear out places that are mined, booby traps. So it's not just a case of carrying on going, because you can end up, getting your equipment blown up by driving over mines that have been left by the Russians withdrawing. There was a case the other day, yesterday I think, that came out that the Ukrainians were having to check every dead Russian body really carefully for mines and booby traps. So this then slows you down. You have to be careful because you don't want to lose people. I mean, we've heard up in Kharkiv by the city, around the city, that people have been dying quite frequently due to mines just out in the fields. Starting to do a bit of farming and whatnot, and they're having their tractors blown apart and so on and so forth by mines. So the Ukrainians have to be careful. They can't just rush around everywhere and chasing people because momentum would dictate that. Or maybe they can, I don't know. But I think there's probably good reason that they are taking their time to process POWs, to process liberated people, to make sure they've got logistics and supplies in place, and to make sure that the places are safe and demined for them to exist in and for them to then use as supply routes. So there is a tension between the need to take advantage and make hay while the sun is shining, and then the need to be careful and cautious and shape the coming battle. So that they might need to regroup, but they'll also be hitting places now that they are closer to the next stage. They need to then shape the battlefield for that next stage. So they will be take for Kherson, for example. They've stopped in this Milove sort of front line up to Brutskensky, and they will be using their artillery to then shape and soften up the area that they will proceed to attack. They're not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for supplies to come in. They will be doing stuff. So I think you need to be careful when making these throwaway comments. I mean, I do that just as much as anyone, but about whether this is good, bad, whether that's rushed, whether that's schoolboy era tactics from the Ukrainians and Russians, so on and so forth. I'm sure that they are, at the end of the day, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, and they have tasted some pretty good pudding lately. They have done a good job in what they've done in the last month. And don't fix what isn't broken. At the end of the day, it's now working. Let them do it in the way that they see fit, and I guess it'll all come out in the wash. To just throw in a bunch of metaphors and figurative language, because that's always fun. Anyway, what do you think? I'm going to play you something now that I think is worth listening to. Just a couple of minutes. So this is Ukraine the Latest, which is a Daily Telegraph podcast, which I think is I mean, I'm not a huge Telegraph fan, politically speaking, but this podcast is a very good daily listen, covering a whole range of stuff. So check this out.
Russian land bridge into Kherson. And then one other thing, we've just had a briefing with Western officials, and one interesting point they made is Ukraine's military was said to be well within the OODA loop of Russia, and in short, the OODA loop means observe, orientate, decide, and act. It's a US tactic developed by the US kind of in and around pre-World War II, and what the Western officials briefing has said, this essentially allows Ukraine to wreak havoc within the Russian chain of command, because they basically can make decisions and they can make these rapid advances at a rate quicker than how fast the Russians can respond. So actually, what it looks like is Ukraine in the south is dictating the operational tempo of the battle. Whether this develops into some sort of kind of strategic success, which allows Ukraine to actually take back and build a strategic stronghold in the south and help further push out the Russians from the area, is still to be foreseen. But actually, all is looking well on the kind of military front, and I will stop there.
So just to let you know, I put him on 1.5 times speed, so you can hear that more quickly. The point of this being that, and I've talked about this in many different ways, this is the NATO doctrine. He's talking about the US developing in World War II, which is to enfranchise your NCOs, your non-commissioned officers. So in the hierarchy of command, you've got people lower down that are able to make decisions on the battlefield by reacting to information that's right in front of them. Okay, whereas the Russian doctrine in the Russian army and the way it's set up is that it's very much a top-down centralized command system, and no one really does anything until they are given the orders from on high, and then no one really stops doing them until they're given the orders from on high. This might explain why they're beating their head against a brick wall in Bakhmut, because they were told to on high, and yet you've got other stuff going on around here where those soldiers could be better put to use, but they're just continuing to do what they've been told because they don't have that on the battlefield reactive command structure. That may not be the case in there exactly, but you get my point, right? And so because Russia are not a reactive army, they cannot react particularly well to the sorts of advances that the Ukrainians are making and making really quickly. And that is causing them a real headache, and is something to consider for sure. What is also worth noting, and I forgot to say this earlier, so I'm going to go back to the Kreminna front line, is that in these holes up here, so basically the Russian defense around Svatove is very poor. It's quite good in Kreminna, and in fact, the Ukrainians don't seem to be attacking much around Kreminna itself. They don't do this full frontal assault, and for good reason, like they didn't in Liman particularly. They waited till they encircled it, and then the Russians ran away. So if they can encircle Kreminna, and then hopefully the Russians can run away, then that's good. But as I said, it appears that they are a lot better defended in these towns. They've had time to dig in, to sort out fortifications, and things are a little bit more difficult around here, at least so it seems. Now, but they're north of there, and basically in all of this area, you've got the Luhansk militia and very poor quality troops, and not a lot of them. So you've got I think it's the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade coming up from, I think somewhere around here, or it might even be south of Bakhmut. The 61st Naval Infantry Brigade have been brought to support here. Couple of things to note. First of all, the airborne and naval infantry brigades are better troops. They are highly motivated and better skilled troops, but they are fairly lightly armed, so they aren't huge impact troops in terms of having the support of, heavy artillery and vehicles and so on and so forth. But they are decent troops. The other thing to consider is that there's an argument that when you start taking decent troops away from an area, then that area then becomes itself weak and victim to attack. So what happened in Kherson is that there was the claim that they haven't rotated their troops at all. And this is a big complaint from a lot of the military bloggers, the nationalists, Russian nationalists, who are criticizing the Russian structure and decision-making in the army, saying that there's been no rotation. These people have been fighting for 6 months and are absolutely exhausted with zero morale. These guys are done. So there was talk about this one particularly good unit being rotated and replaced with a very poor unit, and then the Ukrainians broke through. So it could be that was as a result of the kind of movement that we've seen talked about here, which is the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade being taken up there. And then you're thinking, are the Ukrainians around here thinking, okay, now's the time to attack? this could be a decent opportunity. And then you start talking about, well, is that kind of the NATO doctrine where the lower down the command structure, they can make those kind of decisions, whereas the Russians wouldn't do that. Okay, so that's a broad. I'm not going to go into the Donetsk and Luhansk front lines here. There is a little bit of the Russians are still doing what they're doing around here. There's a little bit of attack from in a couple of places, a few contested settlements around here, and things going one way or the other. But I just don't have time because I've got loads of nuggets to deal with today. So let's get on to them. And I love a good nugget.
Apologies, I recorded the entire video in one, and it turns out that my nuggets on top of the map stuff was way too long. So I've had to split this into two. I know some of you like it all together in one, but really, so the video was over 50 minutes. So I've split it in two. Apologies. The nuggets will come out a bit later today, but here's the map stuff that you've just seen. So hopefully that was all right for now.